Wonderful. Thanks very much, Gary. And thanks everyone for being in attendance today. We know this is a topic of great interest to our audience, and we're really excited to be able to talk about some of the environmental priorities under the historic new administration under Wes Moore. I do want to note briefly that our speakers today may not be able to discuss finer details of specific recommendations that haven't yet been finalized by the working groups. But this is an opportunity to learn about the climate and environment transition team's process and the context in which they are operating. So I would also encourage folks, and a few, or at least one person has already taken advantage of our Q&A chat function. So if you have questions that you would like to address to our speakers, please enter those there. Some of our speakers may be able to answer some of those questions via the chat function during their talks, and will otherwise respond at the end of this session, time permitting. Today, we're going to hear from three speakers. We will have first up in just a few minutes, Kim Coble. Kim joined the Maryland League of Conservation Voters in 2019 after 2 years as the Chief Operating Officer at USSIF, which is the Forum for Sustainable and Responsible Investment. Prior to her role at USSIF, Kim worked at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, including 8 years as the Maryland Executive Director, and then 6 years as Vice President of Environmental Protection and Restoration, where she oversaw CBF's policy, their outreach and restoration work throughout the watershed. Kim holds a Master's of Science in Public Health. She is currently co-chair of the Maryland Commission on Climate Change and was selected as one of Maryland's top 100 women in 2015, appointed as an admiral of the Chesapeake Bay, served as the valedictorian of her Leadership Maryland class, and was a member of the State Ethics Commission from 2015 to 2019. Kim lives in Annapolis with her husband and 2 dogs and enjoys spending time at her 120-year-old cabin in the Adirondacks. We're also going to be joined by Hannah Polakov, who is a managing director at Advanced Energy United, which is a national association of businesses that are making the energy we use secure, clean, and affordable. At United, Hannah specializes in utility regulation and leads Public Service Commission education and engagement efforts around the country. Before joining United, Hannah was a senior policy advisor at the Maryland Energy Administration, where she designed and led a $25 million Green Schools program and served as MEA's liaison to the Governor's Office on Agency Performance and to the U.S. Department of Energy. Prior to that, Hannah served as a senior legislative assistant to U.S. Congresswoman Jane Harman, covering Energy and Commerce Committee issues. A lawyer by training, Hannah began her career as an associate in the renewable energy law practice at Smith Anderson Law Firm, which is the largest law firm in Raleigh, North Carolina, where she helped the firm's large utility client write some of the very first wind and solar contracts in the state as part of their compliance with North Carolina's then brand new Renewable Portfolio Standard law. Hannah received her BA summa cum laude from Duke University and her JD magna cum laude from Duke Law. She lives in Howard County, Maryland with her husband and 4 children. We're also very pleased to be joined by Jacoby Wilson. Dr. Jacoby Wilson is a professor with the Maryland Institute for Applied Environmental Health and Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics in the University of Maryland College Park School of Public Health, where he directs the Center for Community Engagement, Environmental Justice, and Health, which can be abbreviated as SEEGE. Dr. Wilson has 15 years of experience as an environmental health scientist in the areas of exposure science, environmental justice, environmental health disparities, community engaged research, including crowd science and community-based participatory research, water quality analysis, air pollution studies, the built environment, industrial animal production, climate change, community resiliency, and sustainability. He works primarily in partnership with community-based organizations to study and address environmental justice and health issues and translate research to action. So we are still resolving some technical issues for 2 of our speakers who will be joining us shortly, and we will hear first from Kim. I do want to, I can answer one question from the Q&A already. We are using a webinar format, so attendees do not appear on the screen and we cannot hear you directly. So all the more reason, if you have questions, to please direct those to the Q&A chat, as we're not able to have our attendees join us live. And we do have Kim here joining us. Kim, thank you so much for bearing with us through our technical issues. I gave our audience a brief introduction to you and what you do, and so we're very happy to be able to turn the reins over to you for an overview of the Commission's work.
Okay, is Hannah here?
We are still resolving her technical issues, but her
Okay.
invitation is on the way.
Okay, great. So are we waiting, or are we going?
I think in the interest of time, we'll go ahead and jump on in.
Okay, and then Kobe can jump in. Okay, thank you.
Right, thank you for
Go
being
ahead,
here.
Kim.
Great. Well, thank you for having me today. I'm Kim Coble. I'm the Executive Director for the Maryland League of Conservation Voters. It's an honor to join you, and I want to especially thank Gary for inviting me. Gary and I go way back and have had a lot of great moments together, so thank you again. I wanted to give you a framework. I'm going to present the framework for the transition work that we did, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Jacoby Wilson and Hannah Polovnik from AEU, and I'll let her introduce herself as well as Dr. Wilson, because I have to jump in a little bit, so I just am apologizing for that. When Governor Moore was elected, he had Lieutenant Governor Runa Miller serve as the head of his transition team. And Lieutenant Governor Miller put together a wide group of people and allocated 9 teams, created 9 teams. And I was served along with Dr. Wilson and Ed Hatcher as co-chairs of the Climate and Environment Transition Team. Each of the other teams covered issues such as education and healthcare and emerging issues and planning. And so there were all sorts of topics that were covered. And today we'll talk about the Climate and Environment Transition Team that we were a part of. And so within our team, there were 3 working groups. One was on government leadership that Ed Hatcher chaired. One was on air, heat, and water, which Dr. Wilson chaired. And one was on clean energy, which I chaired and Hannah participated in. Within each of those working groups, we were provided maybe about 5 or so policies per topic. And these policy statements were things that Governor Moore had committed to or supported during the campaign. They were items that he had leaned into and believed are important for Maryland's future. So our job was simply to take those policies and developed basically a transition recommendations, how to move those policies forward in the short term, including somewhere between short term was defined as the first 6 months, and longer term was between 6 months and maybe a year or so. So we took those policies and we started developing recommendations on how to achieve what could be done to work towards the achievement of those policies in the short term and the longer term. It was not, I described that as simply, and there was nothing simple about it. It was actually a very in-depth conversation, and Hannah and Dr. Wilson will go through the details of kind of what type of recommendations we put forward. I will say that one of the things the Moore administration felt very strongly about was inclusion of everybody and transparency. And so I talked with the transition director just the other day, and she confirmed that there were over 5,000 Marylanders that participated in the transition team in one way or another. And we had 2 open forum discussions where people could just get on a webinar and talk to us about what was on their mind and their concerns. We did a number of group calls with different constituents. We had some one-on-one meetings. We had follow-up conversations. Additionally, there was a portal through the transition team website where somebody could submit ideas. And all of that was incorporated. We had a running spreadsheet of people's ideas and thoughts on how we could advance clean energy, how we can address water quality, how we can incorporate environmental justice, so on and so forth. So as we were coming up with our recommendations, we would often draw on the inspiration and thoughts that had been submitted. So those were very much a part and very present for us. So the recommendations were compiled into a report that we submitted. And Dr. Wilson and Ed and I have been working with the administration to put the final touches on those. It is still not final. We're hoping in the next week or so it should be, and then it'll be released publicly. And again, we often had to check ourselves because we were not asked to develop the policy platform for the next 4 years for the Moore administration. Rather, we were tasked with helping transition the Moore administration to advance the policies that they had given us. So at times we had to stop, check ourselves, and sit back a little bit. The other thing that made this a little bit hard is the format was really in bullet format. So we were limited in the number of words we could use and how we would present the information. So it was not paragraphs of ideas, rather it was bullets. So we learned to say a lot in a few words. I will say I personally, and I think I speak for Hannah and Dr. Wilson as well, it was a real honor to be a part of this. And I have a great admiration for the inclusivity that the Moore-Miller administration asked us to adhere to. And I felt really proud in the end of the work that we've done with it. So I don't believe there's questions, but Dr. Wilson and Hannah can take it from here. And thank you again for the opportunity to be here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
so
again,
I think,
Hannah.
Sure. Okay. All right. Well, I'm happy to pick it up from here. Thank you. Thank you, Kim, for the introduction and for your leadership of my subcommittee that I was honored to be part of. So as Kim mentioned, I am a member of the Climate and Environmental Policy Transition Committee, and in particular got to work with Kim and the team on the clean energy subcommittee of that, trying to come up with ideas to help feed into the different policy objectives that the Moore administration had laid out around clean energy. And it was a really excellent experience to get to do that and work with other folks who think very deeply about these issues, and to have the input of all of the different folks who did weigh in over the course of the process. As was mentioned earlier, we're not at liberty yet to really talk in detail about what the recommendations are. So for my introduction, I thought what would be helpful is just to lay out what the policies are that we were feeding into, and then, as mentioned, I think we are free to talk about sort of process and some high level concepts, but not specifically the exact recommendations. So so forgive us there for not being able to maybe go as into the details as we would like to. So I'm gonna give again kind of a quick overview of what the 5 ambitious clean energy policy goals are that the Moore administration set out, that we then as a transition team were tasked with sort of filling in the details of implementation on. And then as Kim mentioned, there also was another committee that was around government leadership, and so they had an additional set of goals. And again, I'll sort of highlight those, and then leave the third topic to Dr. Wilson to cover as well. So starting with the 5 clean energy policy goals that my subcommittee was directly responsible for. First one was to achieve a 60% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2031 and net zero emissions by 2045. This particular goal is aligned with the 2022 Climate Solutions Now Act that passed the Maryland legislature last year. That calls for Maryland to reduce greenhouse gases by 60% compared to a 2006 baseline by 2031, and for the Maryland economy to reach net zero emissions by 2045. Such an important goal, given that achieving these goals will will help make Maryland a national leader in equitably improving statewide health and economic outcomes and reducing community impacts from greenhouse gas emissions, especially on overburdened and underserved communities. So that is that goal, sort of in a nutshell, or a wider nutshell. Policy 2 was around expanding clean energy research and commercializing it. So this goal was really to help the state focus on promoting and supporting research and enabling commercialization of new clean energy technologies to enable Maryland to become a hub for innovation and clean energy deployment, to help create jobs, a stronger industrial sector, and to reduce emissions. So again, another really key goal in that, and our recommendations are aligned there. Policy 3 for clean energy was to ensure Maryland generates 100% clean energy by 2035. So whereas the first goal is an economy-wide decarbonization goal, this one is specifically focused on where your energy comes from, right? Where your electricity comes from, or what is powering your homes and buildings. So the goal here is to wean Maryland off of the fossil fuels that are still in the mix, while also increasing the build out of zero emission energy sources to help create good paying jobs, lower utility costs, and emission reductions, and achieve better health and economic outcomes. So certainly a close cousin of the first goal. And then policy 4 was about working with organized labor, our university system, and community colleges to support credentialing and training programs to reskill and redeploy workers displaced by the transition to clean energy, and to benefit groups underrepresented in this field. So here the theory was that if Maryland implements and expands training and mentoring programs through unions, our community colleges and university systems, and local workforce development organizations, specifically targeted for workers who are displaced by the transition to clean energy, as well as groups underrepresented in the clean energy workforce, Maryland will be much better positioned to meet the workforce and engineering demands necessary to meet our ambitious state goals, including those Climate Solution Now Act goals, and will help create more equitable employment opportunities for all Marylanders. Finally, the 5th policy goal under clean energy is to expand solar, wind, and battery storage in Maryland. Again, that goal is a pretty close cousin to the 100% clean energy goal by 2035 and the economy-wide decarbonization goal by 2045. The specific goal around expanding solar, wind, and battery storage is really, again, can't go into the specific recommendations, but just sort of give you a flavor. We were really focused on, how do you give the right signals to the market, to policymakers, including regulators, that Maryland is supporting and encouraging growth in renewables to achieve the broader goals that we laid out. That again, in a nutshell, is those 5 goals that the transition team working on clean energy was focused on. And then again, I just wanted to also, since the 3rd working group isn't here, to just quickly run through their goals as well, which were all around government leadership. They had 5 of their own goals. They're pretty self-explanatory, so I'm just going to kind of list them off in the interest of time, make sure that we have plenty of time for Dr. Wilson's presentation, and then to get into the Q&A. The 5 government leadership goals within our climate and environment subcommittee, environment climate umbrella. One was to appoint a statewide chief sustainability mitigation and resilience officer to work across agencies and ensure that climate and environmental targets are being reached, right? So really, not just having these goals, but really having staff that is and leadership that is focused on achieving these goals across the agencies that are responsible for them in different ways. Second was to employ a whole of government approach. So again, to not just kind of think of these goals as being siloed just at MDE or at at the PSC or else, but really to think broadly across all of government. The 3rd goal was to work to strengthen the state's regional partnerships, such as the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI for short, and ensure that new revenues from the federal government and those generated from the RGGI cap and trade system are reinvested in the green economy to help Maryland reach its goals, right? So the importance of regional collaboration and leadership is certainly critical, particularly with all of the federal money coming down that can be tapped, and the RGGI money that has been growing over the years and can be distributed in a smart way. The fourth goal is to prioritize equity, labor, and justice in all agencies, programs, activities, and initiatives across all branches of government. So to really embed those important elements across all the work that is done. And then the fifth goal for government leadership in the climate and environmental space is to rely on expertise of climate scientists, experts, and stakeholders. So, we don't just wing it, we actually go off the science and what experts and scientists and stakeholders are informing in the process. So I will stop there. Again, want to make sure we have plenty of time for Dr. Wilson and for our Q&A, but look forward to engaging more later in the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So as was stated, my work group was a combined work group. Initially, we had two separate, air and heat was one and water was a separate one, but they were combined. And so if you look at the policy statements for air, heat, and water, we had addressed the worsening effects of extreme heat, including impacts on vulnerable susceptible populations. As we know, there are a lot of issues with climate change, and we see an increase in temperature. And from a public health perspective, when you look at extreme heat, days above 95 degrees, heat waves, look what happened with Pacific Heat Dome some years ago, or the Chicago heat wave in 1995, or recent heat events in our state and in this region. You've seen issues around heat-related morbidity and mortality. So how can we do a better job protecting populations who are vulnerable? Those who may work outside, agricultural workers, individuals who may be vulnerable because they're economic or social issues. Susceptible populations are children, elderly, immunocompromised. Next policy, improve Maryland's air quality statewide, including, again, air quality in disadvantaged and overburdened communities. So you have multiple sources of pollution in the state. You look at energy-related infrastructure and their impacts of combustion byproducts on air quality. Look at building emissions, impact on air quality, mobile sources, bus, trucks, commuter vehicles, what we call traffic-related air pollution. Then you also have other sources, agricultural sources that impact air quality, like industrial chicken farming on the Eastern Shore. So how do we improve air quality is a big focus. And of course, there's another committee that focuses on transportation. So of course, one of the things you see with this current administration is a focus on improving air quality through investments through the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law and electrification, addressing the issues around goods movement around our ports, and also investing in public transit. So that's at the federal level. And of course, there's opportunities to do some of the same things in the state. We also have addressed urban heat islands, including impacts on vulnerable communities and populations. So of course, the extreme heat issues are connected to urban heat islands. So we know urban heat islands associated with red line areas versus non-red line areas, the amount of concrete, asphalt that we have in our urban areas, and albedo effect, the fact that we don't have enough reflective surfaces, not enough green infrastructure. And so again, things that we can do to address that, from changing building codes to other types of initiatives and ordinances, is something that may be highlighted. You may see in the report. And then reducing the air pollution to improve health outcomes, including health outcomes for vulnerable and health disparity populations. So again, we had basically two heat-related statements and two air pollution-related statements. And you think about the health outcomes part, again, when you look at emissions from buildings, emissions from stationary sources like power plants and other parts of the fossil fuel infrastructure, highways and byways, combustion byproducts, and also some of the impacts of air pollution on rural communities from agriculture and other rural practices, you see that those impacts include public health impacts, impacting asthma rates, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, can contribute to other types of impacts, including cancer rates. Also, air pollution has been shown to contribute to Alzheimer's, diabetes, impact cognitive function, right? Also impact reproduction. And so it's multiple negative public health impacts of air pollution. And those impacts are really hit vulnerable populations, and populations have other health issues hard. So there's going to be some recommendations related to that. Then we have a set of recommendations related to water issues. We have a set of policy related to water issues. Restore the Chesapeake Bay watershed in the Inner Harbor. Reduce water pollution to improve health outcomes. So you think about the Chesapeake Bay program, there's been some recent reports about more needs to be done as relates to protecting Chesapeake Bay. So there will be some recommendations related to that in the report. Reducing water pollution to improve health outcomes. So think about the various sources of water pollution, non-point sources of water pollution, stormwater issues, et cetera. And then, how does it impact health, individual health, and also the health of communities. So you'll have some recommendations related to that. Investing in wastewater management and water treatment systems, particularly in underserved and resource-constrained communities. So thinking about our sewer water systems in urban areas, thinking about the fact that we have folks who still own septic tanks and maybe have some needs for resource support in rural areas, also the small systems that you may have in rural areas. So again, just making sure that we are investing in infrastructure to improve access to publicly regulated sewer and water. And of course, as I said previously, there's federal resources that are available through the bipartisan infrastructure law, through our state revolving funds, also monies that may be available through other initiatives at the federal level and state level. And so you may see some recommendations that get to those issues. And of course, going back to the previous statement around water pollution, again, making sure that we are doing a better job of managing our water resources across the state and reducing inputs from various urban and rural sources, various industrial and non-industrial sources. And the last policy statement is take action on sea level rise, mitigate the effects of sea level rise. And then if you look at the platform, a big component of the Moore Miller platform, a big component of the climate environment, section of the platform was really on environmental justice. So there is a policy statement on environmental justice, improve the health, quality of life, and economic opportunities for all Marylanders, including overburdened, under-resourced, and underserved communities and populations by addressing environmental injustice. So that's another one of the policy statements that we worked on as part of this climate environment subcommittee. And I'll stop there.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that overview. We do have quite a few questions going already. So great. Yeah, Hannah is ready to help us tackle a few of these. I think one that might be nice to touch on real quickly is what were the 3 working teams under the climate change team?
So again, we had a clean energy work group. We had a government work group. And you basically had a air, heat, and water work group.
Great. And there were a couple of questions that are very similar and in terms of what will be considered as clean energy under these considerations. So one of those being biofuels such as wood and the other nuclear energy.
Sure. So I can take that one. So in having the conversations and talking about how to frame it in the report, we largely focus on zero carbon emission resources. So we were careful, at least like the goals are the goals, but as we were sort of talking about feeding into the goals, we were using language like zero emissions, zero carbon emission technology. So zero carbon emission does include nuclear. In terms of biofuel, we were very cognizant of feedback that we got during the public process, input opportunities that happened about, what does qualify for things like, RPS tier 1 and what is fair game and what is not fair game. And so we trying to kind of think about how to say this without talking about the specific recommendations, but I should just say we were very cognizant of that and very much focused on trying to get the state to focus on what is a zero carbon emission and not to sort of have different things in the acceptable mix that wouldn't qualify for that. So I'll probably just leave it there.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I would say that I cannot answer that question directly because I was not part of that, but there is a lot of discussion right now from the environmental justice advocates about, I'll just say this, about reforming the RPS and getting incinerators and et cetera out of that. So I'll just say that, but that's not from the perspective of this report. That's just my perspective as an EJ advocate, and that's what we're doing right now. So.
Great, thank you. And a similar, well, maybe not a similar consideration, but on a similar track of thinking, one of our attendees was asking whether the administration is looking at preventing green gentrification and promoting affordability alongside sustainability for either renters and owners, including relating to the role of the Department of Human Services.
That's a great question. So within the, again, I won't say specifically the recommendations, but within the air and heat section, and also water policy statements as well, there is a lot of focus on, you know, trees. I mean, we know that there's a what's a 5 million tree campaign as part of the Climate Solutions Now Act. So there's a lot of energy around that in the state. And then of course, if you step back and look at some of these issues around, you know, mitigation, how do you mitigate, you know, heat, noise, and air pollution? Of course, trees, tree canopy, tree cover is a big part of that. There is a bill that's in session. I think there is an House bill. I think what number tomorrow is going to be a bill discussion about a green equity, a green space equity bill. So I do think green gentrification is an issue. Just again, this is me talking as an environmental justice advocate and someone who does this kind of work. A lot of concerns about when you have communities that have lack of green infrastructure. When we do bring in green infrastructure, that we don't end up doing gentrification. For the audience, gentrification is a form of expulsive planning, zoning, and development, where people, because the trees are planted, property values are increased. If you're not applying the equitable development framework to make sure those long-term residents benefit from that new ecological resource, they get basically priced out and pushed out. So that's a big deal in general in communities that have been impacted by environmental justice issues. I cannot say right now how much of that is in the actual report, but I will say that that'll be a point that I think is going to be raised during the hearing tomorrow on the green space equity bill. So I'll answer it that way.
Great, thank you. We do also have a set of 3 questions that are all perhaps treading the line in terms of getting more finely detailed than anything that we're able to discuss. So I'll open up the opportunity for either of you to comment on either the SC Maglev proposal, wind projects and concerns surrounding those, which might be something that Hannah could touch on, or prioritization of the wild and scenic portion of the Youghiogheny, as to whether there are any comments that you all would be able to make on any of those.
On the wind.
Yeah, go ahead, Hannah.
I was going to say on the wind question, I don't see it in the question. Which one is it?
Do you have concerns about wind projects that are being associated with the death of whales? So, you know, secondary impacts of some of these, you know, non-carbon emitting energy generating technologies.
Got it. So I'm trying to think again, sort of like what I can speak about. For our committee, we were focused on what are ways to promote clean energy. I do know that for in the federal and the state process that happens with BOEM, in order to approve the wind projects, like there is a lot of environmental impact statements that have to happen, and concerns have to be mitigated. So I have to say, like, I can't specifically speak about concerns with whales, but I do know that it's something that in that process that happens between the feds and the state, it is, you know, certainly those environmental impacts are looked at to make sure that anything that can be mitigated is appropriately mitigated.
Great, thank you. I'll pause real quickly to encourage folks to propose some more questions for our speakers, given that I think that the other 2 questions about the Maglev and the Youghiogheny might be getting more finely scaled than anything you'd be prepared to comment on at this time. So for folks in the audience, if you have questions about the process of exactly how some of these larger questions are being addressed within the committee, now would be a great time to bring those up. So I guess maybe if while we wait to see if other questions come up, if you two would talk maybe a bit about timelines or what kinds of outcomes folks might expect in the coming months and at approximately what stages.
Well, I could jump in. You know, as Kim mentioned in the overview, these recommendations, you know, some were short-term and some were long-term. So you can expect to see, as it relates to the transition plan, you know, usually we have like a 100-day plan. You may hear about 100-day plan. Like a lot of those short-term recommendations, you know, based on the ones that make it to the final cut, will be recommendations across the, you know, from the 3 work groups that the administration will try to implement. So you'll see some of that action. There's some things happening right now that are related to some of the things that we've outlined in the report. I know I'm not being clear, but there's some things that happen right now like, oh, that's in the report. Cool. So I'll say it that way. So you have some things that are happening right now in the 6 months, but then you have those, Kim mentioned, you have those longer term. Longer term were more like 6 months to 2 years. So there could be things that could take a longer amount of time due to the fact that the agencies that may have to implement those programs have to go through their own processes of, you know, you have secretaries that have been, you know, appointed, right? They have to build up their staff, they have to develop their plan. So there's a lot of work that has to happen when moving from the prior administration of 8 years to this new administration that I would say this way was probably, y'all, more progressive than the prior administration. But, you know, efforts have to be taken to really build up those agencies who are going to be implementing a lot of the things that are in this in the plan. So so that I'll stop there and I'll pass the mic to Hannah if you want to go more detail or just add to what I've stated. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I would just second that. I think it was interesting as we were doing this process. There were, you know, we as the working group were always guided to think like, well, what is the timeline of this, right? Like when you have an idea, like, does this have to get done like immediately? Is this something that could be an executive order that could be issued, you know, very quickly? Is it something that they need to be ready for legislative session that's about to kick off? Or is this something that, you know, is going to take more time, right? There's steps that have to happen before this thing happens. And so, you know, what is that timeline that you're thinking of? And so I thought that was a really helpful way to be constantly forcing us to think of, okay, you know, here's the big end goal. Great, break it up into what we can do now, what we can do, you know, immediately in 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, et cetera. So again, like without going into more details, folks will see in the report that those things sort of are segmented out, and you can see sort of short term, and then you can see long term. And as Dr. Wilson said, I think it is exciting to see that some of the short term things may already even be in the works before the report comes out.
Just to add a little bit, again, that's why I was trying to reference the federal dollars. There's a lot of stuff that's happening at the federal level that this report captures, right? So that's why I mentioned before some of the efforts around, you know, the language and the ethos in the bipartisan infrastructure law, the language and the ethos around the Inflation Reduction Act. You just saw the $27 billion greenhouse gas reduction fund announcement yesterday, right? That's definitely very relevant to our report. You may have seen, some of you may have seen there was a climate pollution prevention grant that was announced 2 weeks ago. That's definitely relevant to our report. So there's some synergy that's happening at the federal level with what we're trying to do in the state, and you'll see it in the plan. But there's also dollars that's coming down from the federal level to the state. They're going to allow us to implement a lot of the things that are in the plan, which is what we haven't had, you know, with previous administrations. The amount of money, $27 billion for greenhouse gas reduction. A lot of that money is going to go to communities from the EJ perspective, communities that may be overburdened, underserved, to actually bring in zero emissions technology to those communities, right? That is very relevant to the government If you look at the government policy statements around equity and justice and workforce development, and it's also very relevant to the environmental justice policy statement. It's also relevant to the clean energy policy statements. So you see some synergy across the policy statements just in that fund, and we can access those dollars. We'll be able to implement multiple recommendations from the government work group, from the clean energy work group, and also the environmental justice policy statement, and then the recommendations related to the air and heat policy statements too, because they're all connected. So that's just one example. So I want to go into too much detail, but that fund and other funds are going to allow us to implement a lot of the short-term, long-term recommendations that are outlined in the report.
Colby, I'd like to ask you a question, not about the details of the report, but about your role as a co-chair of the committee in the process, and wondered whether or not you'd like to comment on your role as a co-chair and the opportunity it's provided you to bring a perspective to the new governor in light of your own professional background and experience.
Oh yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that question. So for just to go give a little bit more background for folks who don't know me, you know, I am a professor at the University of Maryland. I've been doing environmental justice work, and I actually to change that in the bio. I've been doing EJ work for about 30 years, professionally for probably about 20 years. And so I bring a lot of expertise to the environmental justice, to the air pollution, to the heat work because of my research. Running my center, I do a lot of hyperlocal air quality monitoring of air pollution near traffic sources. We're doing work in Cheverly. We're doing work in Curtis Bay. We're doing some new work in Turner Station. We just got an ARA funding to do some work in Curtis Bay, Turner Station, and also in Cheverly. We have ARA funding with a collaborator to do some work around air quality monitoring near industrial chicken farms, right? We also do a lot of work developing mapping tools to visualize these climate issues. So we help DNR build update its park equity mapping tool. We built the environmental justice screening tool for the state of Maryland. We also are building a climate equity and health mapping tool. We are working with the National Academy of Medicine on their Climate Communities Network program. So we're mapping climate risk across the country to help inform how they're going to engage communities at the local level to do mitigation resilience, adaptation in an equitable way, right? We also just received a grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to fund a climate action and justice hub for the Mid-Atlantic. That was just recently announced this week, right? $2.2 million. So we do a lot of work in these areas. And I'm also a former member of the EPA's National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, which is the oldest federal FACA, on EJ issues. And I'm a current member of EPA's Science Advisory Board. So I bring a lot of expertise, to the federal government to own these issues. And I'm also, I forgot to say, I'm also a member of the air quality team for the 5th National Climate Assessment. Wow. So I bring all the expertise to those entities, and I bring that back to the state. And I brought all the expertise as a co-chair of the committee. So it was a great opportunity to be able to leverage a lot of the work I've been doing at the federal level, as a science influencer. I'll use that term, influencing. I'm also National Academy of Sciences. I do too much. I'm also National Academy of Sciences Board of Environmental Studies and Toxicology. So I do a lot of science influencing at that level. And it's opportunities to talk about cumulative impacts, talk about climate change, talk about air pollution, talk about impacts on overburdened communities, talk about environmental justice, right? Talk about the methane rule. That's an SAB thing we're doing. The heavy duty truck rule. Where, I'm in all those discussions, and I brought that expertise and those connections, that information to this process. And so for me, being a co-chair, it was really just a kind of a mini version of what I do all the time at the national level. Mm-hmm. So it was a very good experience for me, and able to do things to benefit the state more directly, and also to be able to bring in my science expertise, right? But also my kind of policy and advocacy expertise as well, as a co-chair of the committee.
Well, I wanted people to understand the experience and expertise you brought to this process. Many people wonder why specific people get selected for specific roles. And I think you were an ideal choice and a great moderator for our work. And your expertise frequently reflected in the deliberations that we carried out as a team. And I want to thank you for that very much, Dr. Wilson. And
Thank you for that, Gary. Give me the kudos. No, it was fun. I mean, I do way too much stuff, y'all, but it was great to be able to like put everything in like it's like a turducken. Put the turducken into the whole process, because even the water stuff. I mean, I do work on industrial animal operations, so so I've done a lot of stuff in water quality, air quality, climate change. So this gave me an opportunity to really leverage my expertise, both for what I've been doing in the state of Maryland, DC region, and also across the country, and also again my work with my engagement with state agencies and also federal agencies. So thank you for that, Gary.
You're certainly welcome. Megan, are there any additional questions you want to raise?
Sure. We've had a couple more questions come up in the chat. We can just kind of go in order. Any comment on blue carbon or other habitat preservation goals?
There are definitely in the air, heat, and definitely in the water policy statements, there are some recommendations around habitat. So I don't want to say anything more, but we do have that in our as part of the short term and long, a lot of conservation related, not specifically that framing, but a lot of conservation related recommendations are in our both the air. Actually all three: air, heat, and water. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, and we also had a question about sort of the review process for submitted comments. So to what extent were ideas and documents submitted on the portal reviewed?
Yeah, so there was a lot of good stuff submitted, everyone. It was a little overwhelming. All the reports, the memos, the comments. And also remember, we had the two, as Kim mentioned, we had the two sessions with stakeholders, right? When we got, real-time feedback from stakeholders. So we reviewed a lot of the information. We had additional transition team members that helped with some of that review process. And we would try to make sure that, the comments help to inform our thinking about the policy statements and our thinking about our theory of change and thinking about the short-term and long-term recommendations. And so again, as Kim mentioned, things that were in alignment, that were congruent with what was in the platform, those things got elevated and magnified. And things that were not maybe in alignment or congruent with the platform, they didn't get thrown away or anything like that. That information will be still shared with the appropriate state agencies, the appropriate secretaries and staff to follow up. But this transition plan is really about these priorities that were outlined in the platform. But there are other things that may have been provided in comment form, through a memo or through the website that the administration is still going to review and try to address. But they'll do that by working through the agencies.
Right, thank you. We had another question on the energy or in the energy sector. So I'll just read this out and give Hannah a chance to respond. So with both wind and solar sources being intermittent, depending upon conditions, the only other source on the clean list is nuclear. And with new micronuclear plant build times being faster, is a 2035 goal for 100% clean energy practical?
Sure, happy to answer that. So short answer is yes, I think it is practical. And let me give some more details of why I think that is. So yes, wind and solar are intermittent, but there are other solutions out there to balance the intermittency. So for example, energy storage, right? Energy storage is a huge part of the answer for how you balance intermittent renewables. Right now, the state of the art of battery technology is lithium-ion batteries that can do 2, 4, 8-hour storage. So that'll help you in the course of a day, but it doesn't help you over multi-days. But what's really exciting is the emergence of what's called multi-day storage. So for example, I was at last week, I went to the big conference for NASEO, which is the National Association of State Energy Offices. It's the state energy offices from every state, all 50 states coming together for a conference. And there's a lot of education and different excellent speakers who kind of talk about where things are going. The lunchtime address was given by the CEO of a company called Form Energy. They're one of these multi-day long duration storage companies. They were talking about their technology. They've raised, I think, about $800 million now in investment, and they just are about to break ground on a large production factory in West Virginia, and they already have a number of clients lined up for the products that will be rolling off of that line by the end of the year. Long story short, they have 100-hour battery, right? So forget like 2, 4, 8 hours. Now we're talking 100-hour multi-day batteries. And because of the technology that they're using, instead of using lithium ion, they're using iron. Basically, they're using rust. Is one way to think about it. It's plentiful. It's 1/10 the cost, right? So the cost of is coming way down. And so the emergence of technologies like that will dramatically expand the amount of storage out on the grid and then help to balance intermittent renewables, that is what gives me hope, right? And we're not just talking about technologies like that would be stationary storage at a fraction of the cost and an enormous amount of scale. But if you also think about EVs and all the deployment of EVs and the fact that those are basically just mobile batteries, right? And so how do you send the right price signals on the grid so that those can also be basically batteries, right? You can aggregate those batteries into what's called a virtual power plant. And that also is a way that you can be balancing out intermittency from solar and wind on the grid, as well as there's a whole slew of technologies around what's called demand side management, which is things like energy efficiency, demand response, ways that, you don't just sort of think of demand as like something that's out there that you have to meet your supply of wind and solar too, but you actually think about demand side being flexible. And so sending signals to the market that say, hey, you know what, like we're going into a peak time of day. Everyone has their lights on right now. Everyone's charging their EV right now. Everyone all the ACs are running, right? If you're at those sort of peak times of use, there are ways to send signals to the market that say, hey, turn down your AC, turn off your lights, stop charging your EV, drop that demand, which then means that you need less on the supply side. So it also sort of helps when you're dealing with intermittent supply, you can actually also fluctuate your demand curves. So all of that where technology is already and where technology will be going certainly in the next 10 to 13 years until that goal is hit, I'm very optimistic about it. The trends were already looking great. And then you had IRA and IIJA, the big federal clean energy climate bills that came out last year, which sort of put everything on sale, which then again make a lot of the state goals that have been set over the last 5 to 10 years that much more achievable and affordable. So I'm quite bullish about being able to hit that goal.
Great, thank you. Another energy related question asking about how the Moore administration is going to continue the work on educating our elected officials on the harms of creating incentives for dirty energy sources.
I will not speak specifically about the Moore administration, but I think it's very, very, very important. And it's really interesting, the discussions that happen right now in Annapolis, the whole anaerobic digestion bill, study bill discussion, the discussions about getting, again, not sure how dirty incinerators got into the RPS in the first place. But for me as an environmentalist advocate, you cannot advance environmental, climate, energy justice by supporting, and this is just me, this is not the Moore administration, this is Dr. Jacoby Wilson, biogas, supporting incinerators, supporting wood pellets. That's me. So as long as any confusion about the administration, but those things, because we had to be, be fair and balanced, I'll just use that language. We'll see, you'll see how things are outlined in the report. But I think it's important that we have some serious discussions about those types of operations, because they do have externalities. And we don't want to basically, and I'll say it this way, I don't want my taxpayers' dollars going to poison people. Okay. And we need to really take from a public health perspective, right? Do a better job of understanding the impact of those frontline defense, like the Bresco incinerator in Curtis Bay, like the medical waste incinerator, the largest medical waste incinerator in the country is also in Curtis Bay, like the biogas anaerobic digestion kind of movement to entrench chicken waste. I'll say hog waste. My dissertation was actually on industrial hog waste in North Carolina, so I know a lot about poop, everybody. But that's an issue that we need to be serious about. And also, there's huge wood pellet concerns. Wood pellet facilities have been found disproportionately in rural, low-wealth communities of color around the country, and we're exporting wood pellets to other parts of the world. That's an environmental justice issue too. So we can't, in one hand, have the Climate Solutions Now Act, and we're advocating for environmental energy justice and a just energy transition. That's an unjust energy transition if you're having those impacts on frontline fence line communities. So that's me again saying that as an advocate, not speaking as the co-chair of the Climate Environment Subcommittee.
Great, thank you. We also had a request to reiterate the 3 standards Governor Moore has stated when reviewing proposed transportation projects.
Well, that was a different committee, so I'm not sure if I can speak to that. Hannah, I'm not sure you can.
I can't either. That wasn't there was a separate transportation group separate from what we were, which was climate environment.
Yeah, and some of a lot of our transportation related recommendations got pushed to the transportation committee.
Understandably. Another question, curious if this was covered by your committee, as whether there are long-term recommendations regarding food insecurity from an environmental justice lens.
Yeah, so you may have the attendee from the opening, the stakeholder meetings, maybe your own. It's in there, but probably not in there as much as we would like it to be. And so I think, just as a follow-up, and I probably said a little bit too much, just what I just said there. I think as a follow-up, working with the Moore Miller administration, remember, if you go back to the platform, there's some things in there that we want to stick to the platform, right? Composting and food waste as waste streams in general. You think about the breakdown, you do have methane emissions and other climate forcing gases and other co-pollutants, yes. And so I think there's opportunities for that to be addressed. But I would say that, I don't want to say too much, but we talked about it, but we'll see how much is in this plan and how much more work we have to do moving beyond the plan. And I'll leave it there. So let me revise what I said. I want to make sure I'm clear. It was a little bit squishy with that. We talked about it. But in our plan, we talked about it, but I'm not sure if it made the full cut, because we wanted to make sure that the plan reflected was in the platform. Okay. Just want to say that. I'll say it that way.
All right. And we have a final question that I think is a good note to end on in terms of when folks might expect transition team reports and whether those final reports for all the teams will be issued at the same time.
I believe, right, Hannah, it's going to be one big report.
I know all of our subcommittees get rolled up into one report. I don't know that there will be one report of all the different committees. That I don't know.
Yeah, and Kim said that, so just going back to what Kim said, they're still, because I got an email recently, they're still doing final edits. So maybe it'll be next week, it'll be released. So that's not a promise, that's just a hope. But hopefully within the next week or two, but I'm not sure. But we did get an email about it's still, they're close. So I know that's not the great answer, but I'll just say hopefully next week or no later than 2 weeks, please. So yeah, that's all I can say.
Right. Well, I think that's all we have time for, but this was a great discussion, a lot of information that I think we were able to get out there, and really appreciate you both taking the time out to share with us. And I'll turn it over to Gary to close us out.
Well, I want to thank our panelists for the excellent information that they've shared, particularly Dr. Wilson, Kim, and Hannah, for joining us today and realizing the limitations under which the conversation has taken place about the fact that we had originally thought perhaps some of the reports would be out by now, and they have been delayed, which is not altogether unexpected sometimes when these things occur. I will say that the webinar series will revisit the transition report at a later date, probably the latter part of the current legislative session, so that we can look ahead at those short-term and long-term recommendations in a little bit greater detail and share with you how they will frame the future of forestry and education, energy, and of the other issues that have been addressed here today in the year ahead. Thank you very much for attending today, and please join us next month for another, we hope will be an informative webinar to frame the future of forestry in Maryland. Thank you for your time today, friends. Bye-bye.
Y'all take care.
Thank you.